ladies and gentlemen. The microphone's kicked in, that's good. Welcome to the 2024 Education Estates Net Zero Conference. Here for the second year at the LSE, a wonderful venue, and with over 300 lovely attendees. I'm Alex Green. I'm the head of Let's Go Zero, the national campaign for all schools, colleges and nurseries to be zero carbon by 2030. We also run the national network of Let's Go Zero Climate Action Advisors. Our schools and colleges and nurseries are at the heart of our community. Every day, they are quite literally changing our world by what they teach, by the way that they teach, and by the behaviours that they inspire. And we have an opportunity to really help those educational settings to be beacons. Beacons for communities on that complex and challenging road to net zero. The insights and conversations that you will all have here today will inform the way that our schools, colleges, nurseries, universities are built, the way they're retrofitted, and you really have an opportunity to be that glimmer of hope in what is often actually a rather bleak climate forecast. Net zero isn't easy. It isn't simple. But by working together in settings like this, in these sorts of conferences, we really can help to make net zero achievable. So firstly, I'm going to do a big thank you to the conference partners, Emilio Solar Energy, Arcadis, Atkins Realis, Barker, Edison's and Mace, and to the sponsors TM and TG Escapes. Because let's face it, they do the important stuff. They get the fact that we get coffee and cake at lunchtime, which in any conference is the key thing to keep us all going and keep the energy levels up. So without too much, and I'm going to also show you that this is the plan for today. There is a digital guide where you can find out where all the different sessions are. There's also screens out in the networking room out there as well where you can see. But there's a really wonderful array of talks and panels for everyone to enjoy today. So now, I'm going to ask our keynote speaker to come up. So, Dr. Jonathan Dewsbury is the Director of Education Estates and Net Zero for the Department for Education. He is responsible for setting the long-term strategy and delivering on that strategy, so an easy task. And he does that through construction programmes and funding streams. He oversees technical teams working to deliver a resilient, sufficiently sized and sustainable estate. Now, John got his doctorate degree in novel numerical modelling techniques for complex geometry and geomechanics. But luckily, you'll be pleased to know, he's not going to talk about that today. John is going to talk us through the DfE strategy and policy developments and how they are supporting a sustainable and effective learning estate. So, John, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Alex. I didn't think I'd be in a while to get shamed for doing a PhD. Thank you for having me. It's great that we've got a specific conference about the education estate and net zero. My previous role before starting this one, I was the Chief Sustainability Officer at the Department for Education, and both professionally and personally, making sure we get this right for the education estate is really important to me. So, the stat that everyone starts with the education estate is that 37% of public sector emissions come from the education estate, more than hospitals. But if we think about that as a percentage of UK public sector emissions, we know that public sector is only 7% of that. And we know that the UK emissions are only 0.86% of global emissions. Then actually, when we talk about the education estate, we're talking about 0.02% of global emissions come from the education estate. So why bother? Why bother trying to address those emissions? Well, you all know it's far more than emissions. The risks are big. Current global policies are going to hit 2.7 degrees rise. We exceeded that 1.5, that 1.8 we clung on to. The current global policy is going to hit 2.7 degrees global warming. So the risk of extreme heating across all sectors will be felt in education as it will in hospitals and other places. So our early analysis has shown that for 1 day of lost learning will increase to 5 days of lost learning as a benchmark. We know we're going to get 6% more rain. 10,000 schools are already at risk of a 1 in 75-year flood. Quick maths, I think you're thinking around 14,000 schools at risk of a 1 in 75-year flood by 2050. We're obviously legislatively required to do this as well. The UK, one of only few countries to put a legal carbon budget in place. I was, part of my previous role, I spent a lot of time working with international education ministers, and I was lucky enough to have quite a few meetings with Awut Deng Akul, who is the Education Minister for South Sudan. And in 2023, she was overseeing the examinations of her pupils following a flood of the low-lying land in South Sudan. 856,000 people out of their accommodation, out of education. The only way she could get the exams to those places was to fly a plane and try and land them. And when she turned up to where those schools once were, she found pupils waiting to be taught, but with no teachers, because the teachers couldn't get there. That may sound extreme and far-flung, but those are the people around the world on the front face of the climate crisis. And when we look into the UK, we're seeing the trend increase. Last year, school in Harrow, flash flooding, the tube flooded, the grounds of the school flooded, pupils, teachers couldn't get to that school for 2 weeks. We know the economic impact of being out of education. We've seen it from COVID. Some of you may have children that were in that year 7 and 8 class during the COVID period and now coming up to year 11. Those are the most impacted of young people. And their economic outlook for those is different to those that were in full-time education through that period. So if we don't get this right, we lose access to education. So the risk is massive. It's more than emissions, it's about the risk. And then Alex started about the opportunity. Now the opportunity is humongous. There are 16 million people in learning in England alone. So that's not accounting Scotland, Northern Ireland or Wales. We know the number of jobs we can create through this. We think 1 in 5 future jobs are likely to be affected by the green transition. Everything from financial institutions to lawmakers to the things that you might immediately knee-jerk to in terms of heat pumps or solar panels. We know that we need to improve our biodiversity and our nature. We know that we've got a large estate that can help influence this. And we know that the sector that we all work in, construction, buildings, is actually accountable for a large portion of emissions worldwide. So the opportunity is massive, which is why we in the Department for Education set a sustainability and climate change strategy for the whole education system in 2021. And we built that strategy in conjunction with teachers, with environmentalists, with young people, and with leading academics and experts. It's the world's first cross-cutting strategy and an approach to sustainability and climate change in the education sector. And we've set a clear vision that by 2030, we will be the leading country for embedding sustainability in our education system. We're actually one of the only countries that have put this in our nationally determined contributions as part of our COP negotiations. Since we've done that, 24 other countries have followed us. We are leading the way on how we change our education system. And we're trying to do this by 4 strategic objectives. And not thinking about sectors, so we're not thinking about early years, we're not thinking about schools and colleges, we're thinking about the whole system. So how do we prepare our young people to have the right skills and qualifications and education for an economy that's been very different to now? I think about my own daughter. She's 6, full of life. The things that she was learning on school and the qualifications she was going through and the job she will take probably does not exist yet. I know that when I was growing up, the Chief Sustainability Officer role didn't exist. Could I imagine that I would be a Chief Sustainability Officer in my future career? So how do we prepare those young people for a changing world? How do we build resilience into our education state? If we can't keep them operational, we can't teach. So how do we make sure we think about the overheating and the flood? How do we achieve net zero? How do we mitigate the future effects of climate change? How do we meet the legislative targets? How do we demonstrate that those people in those schools and colleges are just to transition? And how do we leave a better environment? How do we make sure that we're not mowing lawns or playing fields 25 times a year within an inch? We're tarmacking over areas. How do we make sure schools are greener? So that's our strategic objective, and we're trying to deliver that through 4 action areas. So looking at the education, so thinking about the model science curriculum at primary level, thinking about the CPD for science teachers, how we teach climate change, natural science in the right way, and so that way we're trying to work out how we get the natural history TTC into motion. We're thinking about how we certify and create trusted resources that are easy to access. So the things we hear about from teachers a lot is they're overwhelmed by access from private sector about things they should teach and things they shouldn't teach. And knowing what to trust is really key for them. In green skills and careers, we've got a plethora of T-levels, apprenticeships, everything from heat pumps to forestry to green accounting. And we're working with the Green Jobs Delivery Task Force, so with DWP and the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, to think about how we have task and finish groups working with the leading organisations in the country, the big employers, to make sure we've got the right skills match the workforce demand. Thinking about the supply chain, how do schools, colleges, nurseries, universities buy in the right way? Good example is we've trialled female hygiene products. How do we make sure that they are natural, decomposable, and how do young people get access to them for free through schooling systems? How do we make sure we procure and buy products in the right way through our school system? 15 billion a year we spend buying through the school system. And then how do we lead on this internationally? So the Western world is responsible for a large part of emissions historically. We need to help solve the problem. And so one thing we're doing is we founded with UNESCO the Greening Education Partnership, and we're the key sponsor of that. And at COP28, I was pleased that was, I think, might have been my last COP for a while. So I've been since COP26, 7 and 8, trying to get this cohort of countries to come together. And at COP28, we've got 80 countries signed up to a partnership to commit to putting sustainability in education through the education system. And more is they committed to being held to account to it at future COPs. So we and other countries will have to go back to Azerbaijan for COP29 and show what we have done in the last year to meet those nationally determined contributions. So to drive this strategy, we have, and sorry, what I missed, which we've all come for, is education estates and digital infrastructure. We're going to talk about it all day. That's why I missed that one. I'm going to come back to that in a second. So, to drive that strategy, and to make that strategy come to life, we've got cross-cutting initiatives that sit behind it. And we frame these around inspire, plan, and act. So the first thing is thinking about the size of the education estate. I think it said 626 kilometres squared on the last slide. That's about, depending on what standard unit you use for your measurements, it's half the size of Wales, twice the size of Great Birmingham, or the size of Exmoor National Park. It's not an SI unit. But the education estate as a whole is large. If we think about every single school together as one national park and inspire young people to be agents of that national park and improve the biodiversity of it, thus learning digital skills, natural science skills, how to analyse, how to project manage, we have the ability to change the biodiversity of the education estate and therefore demonstrate to the UK how we can actually change the direction of biodiversity decline within the UK. That project is live. 1,200 schools have already taken the first steps in that. They've mapped out their site using GIS and are now trying to track the intact biodiversity rating on their sites. We've got 10 million funding behind the schools in the most nature-deprived areas to try and get them to work with our local project managers through the Royal Horticultural Society and the Natural History Museum to drive the behaviours there. So that's about inspiring young people and the school to think about the impacts of climate change to start to make a difference. We then therefore need to help them plan between now and 2050. So in June this year, we'll be pushing out our Sustainability Support for Education, which is a digital support system which helps guide schools, colleges, early years to take a whole systems approach to how they plan their journey to net zero. So think about how they decarbonise, how they adapt, how they approach their skills and careers, how they approach their curriculum and their ethos, their culture within the school, and how they approach biodiversity. And that digital platform is a way of providing verified services and mentorship, but also links into a climate ambassador network, which we've got hubs set up from the country, across the country, which you can see summarised here. So every key university across the country is acting as a hub, and the Met Office are also acting as a hub for us in the southwest to provide that home for those climate ambassadors to get out into schools. And happy that Let's Go Zero also working in that consortium through their carbon ambassadors. Got the name wrong. Alex, remind me, what's the name?
Climate Action Advisors.
Climate Action Advisors are working with the Climate Ambassador Network to make sure we get that into schools. So if we've inspired the change, we've inspired young people to take action on their site, we're putting in the systems to support the teachers, the governors, to plan the change properly. How do we help them act? And I think there are three things in this space. One is funding. How do you give the right financial incentives to do this? So we're working on something called a Net Zero Accelerator, which is around looking at financial models, and Paul Broadbent is here, is going to talk about that later. How do you play back their data to them? How do you make sure they know where their risks are? A school in the east of England is to have completely different risks to a school in the west of England. One's going to be dealing with drought, one's going to be dealing with flooding. So how do we play back those emissions? So we're looking at our condition data collection and thinking, is that fit for the future? So what is the future data collection we need? So from October 26, we want to be changing the way we collect our data, digitising the way we collect the data, and building a digital twin of the education estate, and therefore flowing that information. We're working with the Met Office to quantify our risk strategically to the education estate and where we need to act first, where do we need to put our investment. So let's come to the education estate. That's the big picture we're doing across the whole thing. We need to think about that framework, inspire, plan, act, when we think about the education estate. We need to think about schools as more than a schedule of accommodation, more than 55 metres squared for a classroom. We need to think about them as place. How they, Alex spoke of this, how they are the heart of communities. Nurseries, schools, colleges and universities are the heart of communities. They bring people together. 1 in 6 visit an education setting every day. So how do we make sure we master plan the intersection of education facilities to create those beacons to drive the change we want to see in other sectors? How do we use the education estate to be an example to the rest of the public sector? We're intending to set a long-term strategy to 2050, and we're going to need your help setting that long-term strategy. What we want the education estate to be like in 2050, and what are the steps we take in each of those periods. That's going to be about how do we create the right economic model around that education estate, how do we work with our suppliers, both technical and construction, to deliver the right facilities for ensuring we have a safe, sustainable, resilient and suitable estate for the future. But we can't wait for that strategy to land. We've got to keep moving, because every moment now matters. And we want to continue to move through a cycle, which we've been doing for years. Crawford says he's been doing this since 1945. I tell him I don't think he's that old. But how do we innovate, test and invest? So historically we've had lots of success. So Crawford will talk about this in a bit. We're looking at passive house pilots, sustainability pilots, our net zero in operation pilots, which have led to our investment in a Spec 21, which I think is really forward-leaning. But I also appreciate that some of the contractors in the room have found it quite difficult to adopt that so quickly. So I think as we develop this strategy going forward and think about how do our pilots land into our Spec 25 and our Spec 2030, how do we make sure that you can deliver them on the ground in both your construction or your technical design? And in there you'll see some things that Crawford and Paul and others will talk about shortly. But how do we think about the right funding routes? How do we think about the best approach? We have, as an organisation, focused perhaps on new build and rebuild, but we actually need to be thinking about what is the best model of condition improvement and retrofit. What is the best funding approach? And we're at a good time to think about that, aren't we? There's going to be big change in the next year. Regardless of what happens, there's going to be big change in the next year. And it's a really good time to think about it and put forward those plans. I think I was worried if I talked about us potentially. One example from here. So I was last week at St Mary's Bartholdic Primary School in Derby, which is an amazing project. And the thing that struck me the most is when you walk onto that site in the middle of a busy city, you can hear birds. Because the way they've designed that building, that the pupils flow in and out through open-air corridors protected by the elements, you can hear nature from within the classrooms, but can still hear the teacher speak. I mean, how amazing is that? So why can't we build all schools like that? So I've challenged Crawford to now build a secondary school like that and make sure he does it in time so we think about our future spec and could all of our schools in the future be built in that way. We need to think differently, we need to do differently. And I think sometimes that scares people. Some of you will be thinking, based on your personality, that's scary. Others will be thinking there's lots of opportunity here. I think we know that the Spec 21 was difficult for some of our suppliers to get on board with. I think one of the things we need to do going forwards is think about how we bring you more in to deliver our future specifications and make sure they are manageable and deliverable on the ground. But it would be amiss of me as a civil servant not to come back to government lines at the end of the presentation. That the thing I want to talk about is this government has invested more than any other government in the education estate, 19 billion since 2022. Doesn't probably feel like that on the ground, but it is true, they've invested more than any other government. We are at a point where the education estate, the NAO report says this, I'm not spilling any secrets here, the NAO report has put this out. The large percentage of our stock is at the end of its life and it needs emergency care, it needs restoring. But we've got a really strong pipeline. We're already there. We've committed to 500 new school buildings through the school rebuilding programme. And unlike we have done historically, we're not going to release them at 50 a time. I know right now which 514 schools they are. By July, the whole sector will know where those 514 schools are. So we can start planning to rebuild them. And then my job is to go back to Treasury and say, right, we've done those 500, we now need another 400 for the next 10 years as well. So how can we do 900 in the next 10 years? If I win that argument, we will see. We're doing more than just schools, which is why we talk about we're maturing from capital to education estates. We're investing 300 million-ish in secure children's homes. So 5 secure children's homes that some of them we're centrally delivering. And so we have to think about our specifications for those children's homes. We've obviously got a condition programme in FE, 2.8 billion being put into FE. And we know that the dynamics of the education sector, we're seeing more need for SEND, more need for alternative provision. And I think looking at the number of young people that have EHCPs, we need to think about how our speculative accommodation or how our layouts of school work to provide the right specialist support for those people. So, I think, to conclude, DfE's capital is maturing into education estates, and we want to be one of the best clients going forward in the public sector. And the reason we're maturing is we need to tackle the challenges ahead of us. The challenges we've had in the last 10 years have changed, and we need to be ready for the new challenges. We want to be an example to the rest of the public sector on how to do this right. And we want to be the catalyst for retrofit and adaptation in the public sector. Why do we want to be that? Because we have to show our young people and learners that it is possible. Because our world ultimately depends on it. We need to show we can do it in this sector, and therefore we can transform it into other sectors. And that is why the 0.02% of public global emissions matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Amazing whirlwind tour of all the activity that's going on within all the different teams at DfE.